Okay, we're live.
We are live.
It's nice to see you, Kasiliak. I actually don't know how to pronounce your profile, but
Castiliac. Yeah,
Kasiliak.
he's been engaging pretty frequently. It's good to see him here.
Welcome everyone joining. We're going to be interviewing Dr. Gupta from NYU, so we're super excited. We're going to
Mhm.
take just a couple minutes to let people filter in.
What's your Twitter handle, by the way?
It
The best
is
one.
Boyd Inst, INST. I think that's the full handle. It's just BOYDINST.
Okay, great. How are you all doing today?
Doing great.
Awesome.
How about you?
Doing well.
Yeah, thanks for
Happy
joining us. So
no, wait, please go. Will.
yeah, so I was just gonna give like maybe a 60-second pitch on the Boyd Institute. It's a fairly new think tank. I think it started in 2023. Jeff, the founder, has brought Peter and I on within the past year to sort of spearhead these policy sprints that we do quarterly. This one is on housing, and really our goals are. You can think of it as like sort of a VC approach as opposed to maybe a traditional fund manager, where we are looking for like bold, asymmetric um, policy solutions and ideas, and maybe one out of every 5 or 10 is actually politically feasible, and actually has some high impact. So we're looking for home runs, and we're about midway through our housing sprint, and we've come across a lot of your work. Really enjoyed it, and so wanted to give you the opportunity to share that with our audience and go from there.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
hmm Yeah, so I think Peter and I discussed. I think we want to kind of like start at the top by framing the issue. A lot of people throw around the housing crisis, nomenclature for what we. But how do you see it? How do you frame the issue? Is it a national crisis in affordability? Is it regionally? Are there pockets of extreme unaffordability? Is it spatial misallocation of resources? How do you think about it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I have a maybe slightly heterodox view actually of what housing
hmm
affordability entails. Because I think what most people have in mind when they think about housing affordability is something like rent to income. How much of your budget are you spending on rent or on housing expenses more broadly, right? That's kind of the critical threshold for determining a lot of these housing burden statistics. And the challenge I think in using that as the metric is that number. So what rent turns out to be as a fraction of your income is like remarkably stable across different geographies, across different time periods, et cetera, et cetera. So that's in response, however, to a lot of compensatory behaviors that households are doing. And we as economists kind of club that in the technical terminology of homothetic preferences. What that just means is that when your income doubles, the amount of money you spend on housing will probably also double. Um, if and that's because people respond to income shocks by wanting more bedrooms, wanting more space, and that's perfectly great. That's a perfectly natural way for people to respond to having more money. Like so, a normal good would be one that you increase your allocation to with more money. Think of like a luxury watch or something. A inferior good, something like food or something, is something you decline your fractional spending on as you get richer. Housing is kind of like right snap dab in the middle of that. It turns out. And what that means is it's really hard to use how affordability is this measure of rent to income because um, what happens in different markets is that people increase their housing demand or they're just really insensitive about their housing. They really want to kind of purchase a certain amount of housing. Anyway, all that kind of is challenging. At the same time, when housing does get too unaffordable in a particular area, people move. So
hmm
locally, it's going to look like there's not that much unaffordability, but in fact, people have already made these compensatory sort of there's challenges. So the way I think about housing affordability is can people live where they want to, ideally, right? Are people able to access housing typologies that they kind of want to live in? Are they able to access job markets that they want to be in? Are they able to access amenities that they really want to access? Schools, parks, nature, and so forth. And under this metric, I would say, and you also have to stratify, I should also add, by incumbents and new people. Because when people are talking about housing affordability, I think what they really mean is if you're a new buyer now, it's a nightmare. If you're buying a new home, if you're moving and you're getting a new apartment, you're facing a very unaffordable landscape. Again, if you were to just actually look at the like rental burdens faced by incumbents, it doesn't look as bad actually because you've got a lot of homeowners that are sitting on their, two-handle, three-handle mortgage. So their housing burdens don't actually look so crazy. It's the new buyers that are faced with these super high prices of rents and house prices that then constrain where they're able to go, what they're able to do with their lives, and that is how I define housing affordability crisis.
So this is really interesting. I have a follow-up question on this. So if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, basically people target some share of their income that they're going to spend on housing, and then they like choose, I guess, like the housing product that they can afford, such that they get that targeted percent. And then you mentioned that when you think of the affordability crisis, it's sort of that people aren't being able to get access to the types of units that they want. How much of this is just like we exist in a world where there's like scarce resources? Everyone wants to live on the beach in California, right? Everyone wants to live in Malibu. You're always going to have, by that definition of crisis, like some type of crisis. I'm just interested how you think about that angle.
Yeah, that's a great point, and you're right that if you think about housing constraints as being relative to some kind of like frictionless optimum, well, that's always going to be difficult to attain for some people. So you have to sort of define and think about what would a middle class lifestyle look like, or what would be a reasonable setup of housing attainment for many families. And so you kind of have to think from the standpoint of what is a reasonable bundle of households to be able to access, given their other limitations, their income, so forth. And I think the challenges that we kind of face right now is we are kind of facing challenges on sort of all those different dimensions of uh, labor markets. So historically and in the past, households have been able to kind of move and access different labor markets that correspond to the areas where they're going to be able to get the best labor market returns. And that kind of access to those sort of superstar markets is pretty constrained right now. To move to New York or to
Mhm.
move to San Francisco is really hard and expensive. So it's the ability to access these kind of frontier labor markets that offer these kind of best labor market returns. I think that's a real challenge. Then on the
Mhm.
typology side, this is kind of newly being thought of as an issue with respect to kind of the fertility crisis and people having fewer children, but being able to access units and typologies that sort of have just enough bedrooms, enough space, enough greenery that they can sort of sustain and support a family is a huge challenge for many households. And it's hard to know how much, but that appears to be a contributing factor for why households aren't starting families. So adopting that as a frame, you would sort of think about, okay, there's sort of a typology that households have in mind when they want to start a family. And that typology does seem to be out of reach for many households. And that is kind of constituting a crisis, even if they ultimately wind up then sorting to a unit that does kind of meet their budget with respect to rent, rent and income. And then finally, in the amenity space, I would sort of think of school access as being an important dimension of what, again, it doesn't need to be the case that every single household accesses the very best school district, but are there enough school districts? Are there enough areas that offer all the kind of amenities that households are looking for? Is that generally accessible to people or not? And particularly, is that accessible to new entrants into the market?
Yeah, so you've talked extensively about sort of, I guess, fiscal zoning, especially like this is a good dovetail, I think, into property taxes. In California, you have a structure where municipalities don't really have the ability to raise property taxes to bolster infrastructure investment or to increase school funding, so on and so forth, to increase the amenities of the community. And so, downstream of that is sort of this, I guess, corporatism, where you have communities that there's like a homeowner's veto, right? And so, in terms of property taxes, you did a wonderful study on this, with using the Texas counterfactual, Texas level property taxes in California, and showed that not only would overall home ownership rise, I think 6%, but youth home ownership would rise 8%. Can you talk a little bit about that? What are the sort of mechanisms at play? And then maybe if you are pretty well versed on MUDs, municipal utility districts, maybe how that plays into like greenfield development.
Absolutely. So that kind of pertains a little bit what you're saying at the end with the MUDs or PIDs or whatever they're kind of called, PUDs. That's about sort of the political economy and sort of
Hmm.
infrastructure and structure of our zoning. So I'll get that in a second, but just on the more basic idea of what property taxes are doing to this kind of life cycle view. So there's a paper joint with some co-authors where we're sort of thinking of the trade-offs inherent in lock-in forces with housing markets in general. So I kind of mentioned already a little bit that we have this sort of lock-in feature where households are kind of stuck with low interest rates and kind of don't really want to move to kind of new house. And we're sort of thinking of property taxes as one way to kind of break that a little bit and kind of get a little bit more churn in housing markets. Now, the first order thing is we need more housing supply. So that's kind of a given. But given that we have the housing supply that we have, how can we kind of break this lock in force that's leaving a lot of households stuck in place and kind of get to a little bit more churn in ways that ultimately can reallocate more housing towards these newcomers that are trying to access different amenities? So the basic idea of the paper is that property taxes kind of combine a capitalization force because they're baked into the price of the home. I.e., if I have two equivalent properties, one is going to have a higher property tax levy than the other, then, well, I'm going to pay less for it because it's coming with this future liability. And that actually improves the like upfront affordability of the house. Like the price is lower. Now, assuming that's all kind of baked in sort of rationally, well, I've just got a trade off between a house that I can sort of buy free and clear and one that I have this kind of ongoing property tax liability to pay. But households, particularly young households, don't necessarily have that down payment that is necessary in order to get the leverage to buy the expensive product. So what we sort of find is that property taxes, and we have some data and modeling to kind of support this, are able to kind of lower that upfront price in ways that kind of encourage that households to kind of get in and be able to be that initial starter home for them. And then as they kind of get older, this drag of property taxes paying year in, year out kind of encourages a little bit more efficient utilization. Sort of kicks people out a little bit if they're staying in the unit for too long and sort of counteracts those lock-in forces. So generally kind of results in a little bit more of this churn that could reallocate housing towards, again, some of these younger households that may need it. The fiscal part of it that is also interesting now. So one of the reasons that California seems to have like a very anti-housing policy is that the municipality doesn't really get that much from it, right? So if I
Hmm.
zone and allow for more housing, I have to now pay for the infrastructure, the schooling expenses, et cetera, for these new residents, and I'm not necessarily getting that much from the units. Now, it's not as simple as that because Proposition uh, 13 in California that has these property tax rules does allow for higher taxes on kind of new development. So there is some fiscal recoup that can be done. Nonetheless, it's still the case that California schools are not that good. So I think that's
Mm.
sort of related to this issue. It's kind of hard to get the fiscal instrument to sort of pay for the schools, and that it just kind of makes you a little bit more wary of newcomers and people that are going to be kind of taking your existing pie, right? It kind of leads to this sort of anti-growth, sort of zero sum type of style of politics.
Hmm.
Whereas what you do see in Texas and other states that have these instruments like the MUDs and so forth is that I can kind of use this sort of future property tax revenue as a form of value capture. And if I have a municipal bond that's going to be repaid from the property taxes, that allows me to build upfront the infrastructure that's going to sustain the community, right? So this is a very successful style of policy that sort of a virtuous cycle that encourages the municipality to want new development because they're going to get this incremental stream of revenue from it that can then go and be used to pay for the improvements in the first place necessary to get this all going. And it kind of seems to make these Texas municipalities a little bit more pro-growth in their mentality. It's not as zero sum when the newcomers are kind of bringing in some revenue with them.
It's fascinating that, like, from an economist perspective, like land value tax is obviously a very efficient tax, and property taxes in general have these like nice, you know, effects of like incentivizing the type of behavior you want. But then from a political economy perspective, they seem like insanely unpopular, right? Like in Florida, for example, it looks like they're going to like permanently get rid of them, was my understanding from the news. I wonder, do you have any thoughts on that? Kind of like where in the public discourse, this disconnect between people say Texas housing policy is awesome. It seems like, property tax plays a big role in that, but that just like is not breaking through to like the general public discourse.
Well, I mean, one thing to bear in mind is the U.S. does have, internationally speaking, relatively high property taxes.
Mm.
So compared to Europe in particular, which is taxing everything else in Europe, but they typically have fewer property taxes as we would recognize, and certainly fewer land value taxes. So they're typically more commonly relying on transfer taxes, which again is kind of bad because you're disincentivizing the churn of people, or they have very lagged assessments, which are kind of not really responsive to changes in those economic rents. So, by contrast, we have this political economy regime that does seem to tolerate at the local level a lot higher property taxes than happens internationally. Places like New Jersey and Connecticut actually have like quite high property taxes internationally speaking. So, I don't know how to entirely know how to square the circle there, because I do agree
Yeah.
with your point, which is that the existing levels of property taxes seem to really annoy people. Now, one thing
Yeah.
I worry about with respect to this dynamic is going back to kind of demographics growth. I think basically the reason we kind of got to a relatively high property tax equilibrium is we would put a lot of this stuff on the ballot. Different municipalities would leave it up to referendum or votes. Do you want to pay for this bond referendum, which will result in more funding for the school? And then you're going to have some assessment, some millage, whatever it happens to be, on your school district to pay for it. And it was that kind of local tie, and it's the schools and the kids. And that sort of, I think, led many people to say, like, okay, I don't really want to pay taxes, but I
If
understand
I'm
where
going
it
to be
makes for.
paying a tax at all, like I would like it to be as like consumed locally as possible, and this is like the best
Yeah,
case scenario.
exactly, exactly. So there's that
Yeah.
local tie aspect of it, and we had a lot of kids, so people kind of saw that divide. Now you look at Florida, and it's obviously an aging state,
Yeah.
so you now have a large contingent of those elderly residents that they don't necessarily have school age kids themselves, and so they maybe don't value those kinds of local public goods provisions
And if you can like
as
take
much.
this like forced mortgage off their balance sheet, it's like they really like it a lot, right? So that makes a lot of sense.
Exactly, exactly. So I worry that the previous property tax equilibrium we were in was sort of sustained by this degree of sort of pronatal preferences and kind of intergenerational sort of stuff that now might actually be harder for us to implement. So even though property tax would be a vehicle to kind of get more of these intergenerational things, uh, it's exactly because of that the gerontocracy kind of might kick in a little bit and lead to the resistance of that.
Mhm. Um, I do want to sort of touch on the SB 79 bill in California, along with the raft of other legislation recently signed. Um, the California Unionbies, it seems like a big win. Celebrations are in order. I've seen you and a few others display some skepticism on exactly how consequential it is. Um, can you take us through how you see it? I mean, so transit oriented development is the intention is for it to be legalized and sort of this massive middle going up near commercial corridors. But it's one thing to pass legislation, and it's another to actually to have these things pencil. For example, in Minneapolis in 2019, there was a relaxing of land use regulations, yet some still stood, which rendered things sort of still economically infeasible. And so I don't know how familiar you are with the legislation, like on the whole, that was passed in California. It was a lot. But can you take us through like what may still be the impediments to bringing on new supply?
Yeah, great. So I did get a little heat for the comments on Twitter. I'm unfortunately a very contrarian person by nature. So even if I love a policy, which I do with this SD thing, if everyone else says they also love it, part of me is always just a little
Hmm.
contrarian about it. But it is coming from a genuine place, which is, I think, one thing that we've seen systematically across zoning reforms across the country is that the details really matter. So
Hmm.
you can have an ADU policy passed in two jurisdictions, one of them being wildly more successful than the other. And why is that? Well, it often comes down to these little details of, well, was there a parking requirement that came in with that
Right.
ADU? Was there an owner occupied requirement that kind of came in with that particular rules, right? So these are, sort of exactions or rules or things like that. And I do think one of the biggest problems we have in housing policy is the trade-offs entailed in these different types of exactions are not really internalized by the legislator or by the policymaker, because it's very easy to kind of add on these rules and requirements and not really think too much about what is that going to do to whether or not the thing pencils out. Here in New York City, we have one version program for office buildings to residential that seems to be working very well. We have another property tax abatement program for 85X that is working for units under 100 units and is not working as well for units above that. And the reason is there's sort of a cutoff and there are different labor requirements on one side of the cutoff than the other. So that's another example of how these kind of rules and exactions really matter. So it's even the same city, the same program, but different sets of rules for different units. Now coming back to the California reform, so it's legalizing units in some radius and perimeter around transit stations, which is great. Again, to be clear, this is transit oriented development. This is kind of where we have the greatest demand. We should have more and taller buildings, but there are a few things I wonder about. So there is some degree of an exclusionary housing requirement, right? So that some units are going to be set aside for low-income residents. That has a lot of benefits of ensuring that, again, the different typologies and things play out so as to allow people of all income levels to kind of access this housing. But it is a cost. Now, it does seem, all things considered, to be a relatively minor inclusionary zoning kind of requirement, but that is one feature of it. There are other rules that municipalities can ladle on themselves to kind of affect that. And that's one thing we've seen a lot in places like California, that there might be a state level rule, build those remedies sort of thing, and the municipalities find ways, if they're really not super into housing, of kind of pushing back against that. So that's just a concern with sort of a more top down sort of state led approach that you have in California. And then just another thing I wonder about, then there's also some union sort of requirement kicking in at a higher weight, higher level of height. And then the one thing I wonder about in general is this whole challenge of developing infill versus greenfield. So infill development, right, is we take a housing unit, we sort of tear down what is there, and then we build a higher unit. Ideally, in places like California, we would have more of this missing middle typology, right? This kind of like gentle density. And the challenge, and we have some great new research on this, is by Vincent Rowlett from MIT, is that it's very hard to do this infill stuff because you have to like buy the plot. It's already pretty valuable. You have to spend some money to tear it down, and then you're going to build up. And you can only build up in this one little lot that you've purchased. So the economies of scale really aren't there. So just like fundamentally, the economics of infill are very hard anywhere in the country, regardless of whether or not it's legalized. And if you're only going to then do like a little bit of this gentle density stuff, like I would go from like, single story to like, a few stories, that again is kind of nice for these sort of typology reasons, but it's not really getting that much bang for the buck, right? If I'm going to have to go through all of these expenses. So like what I would actually sort of like in some sense is for us to just like tear down these houses around transit stops and go way higher. So places like Jersey City here around New York that are really doing a lot of new development, they're doing that. They're tearing down like the small thing and they're going way higher. And I think it's because there are so many frictions and challenges involved in the development process that the only way to really pencil out a new development is to just like really max out the sort of space. And then once you do that in California, then you kind of seem to run into a whole other set of issues. So I don't want to sound like too much of a crabby person. I am optimistic. I do wish California but I do think the details of how the rules actually work are important for unlocking as much housing as possible.
Yeah, and in Jersey City, I think I read a piece and we shared it on our Substack a few weeks ago, where there was this combination of rent control there as well as like developer incentives that seems to have kind of worked out, right?
So you mean like the Mount Laurel doctrine stuff or other aspects of Jersey City?
Yeah, well, I'm sorry, I'm kind of blanking on exactly what it was. I just remember that there was a combination between some rent control, but then also like public-private, incentives, tax incentives, I believe, for developers to throw out those high rises. And I also
want
want
to like walk the needle between like preserving kind of like local, like not like trying to avoid displacement as much as possible.
I also want to get your opinion on this like filtering effect. We've shared some research on it. And to your point about like sort of the economic infeasibility of urban infill of the missing middle, a lot of the time, um, to the extent that, if you throw up market rate multifamily developments, or even luxury developments, that there is a self-sorting mechanism that takes place and it actually unlocks affordable supply. Um, wouldn't it make the most sense just to, like you said, like just build up higher and higher?
Yeah, I mean, there's also some work by Pew that has argued that kind of for these reasons, the biggest rental impact on new housing is felt on the lower end of market rents. So that's sort of totally consistent with that sort of filtering approach.
Mm,
That you can, even if you're building kind of new buildings that are kind of luxury on the high end, that's kind of will sort of affect all segments of the market.
mm,
Um, I'm certainly very sympathetic to that. So I think it's also not unique to let's say new developments in the city. So we have new cities we could develop, right? So California Forever has recently kind of with this proposal for building brand new city might have 400,000 people. So one benefit of
mm,
that is now that you're doing greenfield, now you're doing a whole new city. Actually, you can do a lot of this gentle density stuff, right? If you're building the
mm,
typology for the very first time, sure, like go crazy and do whatever you have, whatever you do with the first building is probably going to be a little bit conserved. It's probably going to be persistent for a while. But that I think is a great place to try out
mm.
gentle density. And I'm
So
very
I
glad
have
to
a
see that's kind of a big part of their plan. But just the point about filtering, if we have 400,000 people, let's say, living in, this area around the Bay, does that take some of the pressure off of California SF rents, so maybe that sort of filtering argument can work both with respect to new luxury buildings in the city itself, which might potentially have some offsetting gentrification effects, but also new cities, um, remote work potential that kind of like can,
Mm,
kind of absorb some of the kind of extreme levels of demand.
So one of the things that I found really interesting when you were talking about like the California context is that the details of the law matter a lot. And I'm thinking about this in terms of the Louis et al. Paper. I don't know if you've read it recently. It has like a very inflammatory name, like the supply constraints do not explain housing price
Oh,
quantity
right,
growth
right.
across the U.S.
Yeah, right.
And I'm interested in this because you have your own paper where you look at you try to come up with this like new measure for kind of regulatory constraints. And if you can talk about it in just a second, but my question is this is like, first off, what do you think about that paper? Like, what do you think it is that like these traditional measures seem to be failing to capture? We did some of our own analysis and we found kind of a similar effect that at least the Wharton measure seems basically uncorrelated with multifamily unit permitting, which was like surprising to me. And then the Louis et al. Result also seems fascinating that at least if you take these as measures of supply elasticity, they seem kind of like uncorrelated with like these outcomes you would expect. So just I guess if you've read that paper, do you have any thoughts on it? And then kind of like segueing into your own measure and what you think, why you think it's better, and if you think that it would, they notably didn't use your measure. So I was interested if you think that it would kind of like, maybe explain the result that they had.
Yeah, so I'm still a little uh, agnostic about the nature of the result, but what they're sort of basically finding is that existing measures of supply elasticities kind of across in the cross section across the U.S. don't seem to particularly predict these ultimate shifts in income and production in the way that you would sort of expect if they were kind of really binding in some places and not so much in others. One reason I'm so sort of ambiguous about it is this sort of paper and subliterature is getting really into the weeds of like how sort of endogenous are the income measures. So that's sort of one big
Mm,
question. So they're sort of looking at these sort of metrics of income that are really like people times per capita income, total income in an area, and how much, what is the sort of the relationship between sort of total income and total units in areas with sort of high and low sort of supply elasticity. So a lot of the pushback has been, well, that's sort of endogenous again, because some of the reasons we talked about at the beginning, if I make it really constrained to build and people won't come here, and then I'll just have less of this total income in the first place. They have a whole response to that. So they have a whole argument on why they think the sort of endogenous income measure is actually the right one to sort of think about. So I'm still not sort of trying to figure out how to digest that sort of back and forth. Sort of a simple person, I would sort of rather just see like if you showed me with a really crystal clear sort of exogenous income shock that led to the same amount of housing in different places. I would sort of be convinced by that. They have one of those in the paper, but it is a little bit special, kind of around remote work and COVID.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm.
so the other possibility, which I'm actually open to, is that they are picking up something real, which is that the supply environment is just sort of nationally restrictive, and
Yeah.
it seems particularly restrictive in places like SF or in New York, just because that's where the demand is the highest, and that's where you're going to kind of run into these barriers the most. But actually, it's sort of constrictive everywhere, and so we have a measure of housing constraints that is derived from the LLM analysis of regulatory zoning documents. And I wouldn't say that's exactly what we find, but that is like closer to what we find than what I would have expected ex ante,
Yeah.
which is to say, even places like California, which I would have thought as being very strict on regulation, we do find it is strict on some types of regulation, particularly process regulation. On other measures of regulation, for example, things like minimum lot size, it actually is not particularly does not stand out in the country. It's actually like the Northeast that really stands out in minimum
Mm.
lot sizes as being extremely restrictive on that dimension. So that is it's all a good debate, I think, for people to kind of have and tease out, it's possible for zoning and housing regulations to be kind of nationally restrictive as well as kind of varying kind of across the country in different ways.
I have one quick follow-up question on this, and then we can move on, which is, when as I've been thinking about this, it seems like maybe part of the explanation is that there are these like non-statutory constraints that are actually driving like the supply elasticity variation across like places like Texas and California. That it could just be that like within California, in the city councils, there's like a culture of vetoing new construction or something like that that just does not exist in Austin.
Hyperlocalism. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's like then any measure where you look at like a statutory direction, you're going to end up in kind of a situation where you're like, well, I'm keep picking up the legal system, but I'm failing to pick up kind of these like more important cultural dynamics. Do you think that that's plausible, or what?
Yeah, for sure, and for sure, and it could be that those procedural questions or the sort of local vibes sort of like interact with the regulations in a very complex way. So maybe in some jurisdictions, because they have a relatively flexible regime on certain dimensions, they kind of become more NIMBY in other dimensions, maybe harder to measure dimensions. So it's obviously something I think about a lot, and we're hoping to expand our measure. We have some of these measures, I think, in our current approach on sort of the procedural barriers and limits on production, things like public hearings and wait times and as of right distinctions and so forth. But we'd love to get more and a better understanding of what are the procedural sort of state capacity, sort of other limits and restrictions to housing, which I agree are both in the statute and outside the statute.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you.
I did want to sort of pivot. There was a lot of research on this over time, and I know you are a finance professor, and so I kind of wanted to get your take on what is the sort of prevailing way to value a house. I know that like early stage in like the Schiller days, there was this dividend discount model. And then there's also been like something that looks like a discounted cash flow model, basically like the potential rents that could come from that property, and like the terminal value of those cash flows discounted to the present. What's the latest sort of prevailing academic consensus on the way to value homes, and I guess more broadly at the macro level, like how do rents tend to interact with home prices, and why have we seen sort of these like convergences and divergences between rents and actual home prices?
Yeah, those are great questions, and I don't know if there's been a lot of recent work actually on those topics, but you're right; they're totally relevant. I think you're right that the framework remains the same as sort of before. We sort of think of the house price as the discounted sum of future rents in some way. Um, there are, some additional complications and things layered onto that. So if I own the home versus with the rents, there's different tax treatment potentially. There
Mm.
is, different financing prospects. There may be some of this sort of convenience or sort of amenity value I just kind of get from owning. So there's sort of non-utility sort of or utility kind of components of the returns, not just the rental returns that are important to sort of factor in. One example of this sort of style of research is Rebecca Diamond and her brother Will Diamond have a paper looking at black-white returns in housing. And they find that kind of taking into account the sort of counterfactual option of like, okay, you do renting instead is sort of really important. So like once you take into account the fact that owning, you know, is taking care of a housing need for you and you have to rent somewhere, it turns out they find that the returns to black ownership are a lot higher than you would have if you didn't kind of factor in all those sort of features. So basically, measuring what is the return from a housing unit is hard because it's both kind of matches some type of rent, but also sort of other sort of components. But conceptually, it sort of seems right that whatever all that stuff is, if we kind of value a house as the sum of that stuff in the future. And then the next part, as you're kind of hinting at, is okay, well, if that's the thing that houses are, they're capitalizing these future cash flows of some sort, then why are they moving around all the time? And there are a few different parts of that. One, which is just like any other financial asset, is the um, sort of like discounting sort of effect, the valuation effect. So just like a price to earnings ratio moves around all the time based on
Hmm.
kind of market forecasts of expected returns, monetary policy, euphoria or whatever in the market. The price to rent ratio also moves around all the time based on kind of all those same factors. In particular, one thing and hoping to have some research on this soon is the role of monetary policy in particular, right? So we've had a
Hmm.
lot of QE, a lot of bond purchases, and so you can't imagine that sort of affects the sort of buying and renting trade-off. That is matched then with the seller's decision. So I've bought a
Hmm.
home, I own a home, I should sell it, and what should happen, kind of as per our discussion up front about property taxes, okay, well, I guess more painful or annoying to own the house, well, then I should sort of sell it more, and then I should sort of sell it at a lower price, right? If there's this kind of additional levy or payment to be made along with it. So that would happen if there's a higher property tax levy or if interest rates go up. And the next
Hmm.
buyer, now has to discount whatever at a different interest rate. That second part, the asymmetric drop, doesn't really seem to happen in housing. That what you would like to happen with an asset is so it's sort of like housing is sort of like a financialized asset on the way up, but like not on the way down. So when interest
Hmm.
rates fall, and the house price goes up because easier credit, bidding, et cetera, et cetera. When those interest rates go back up, you would sort of expect the price to drop. I've been expecting this to happen for years now, and like it doesn't really happen. Which is interesting. What happens instead is the lock-in effect we were talking about. The person just sits there, and they choose not to transact. And then what happens is the inventory is missing. No
So
one
yeah,
is.
supply is taken off the market.
Yeah, it's all kind of taken out the market now. It's true that supply is taken off the market. However, they're also not a buyer on the other side for the next transaction. So it's all
I
complicated how
see.
that all nets out. But the long story short is it seems like housing is a one of these goods that is priced not just in a sort of fundamental asset pricing sort of semi future rents thing, but also in a sort of bilateral search market.
Hmm.
And one of the
Hmm.
things that sort of seems to happen in these types of search markets is in order to kind of get any interesting price discovery, price action, it kind of has to show up first in an inventory margin.
Hmm.
It kind of has to be available supply on the market before the prices actually start to drop. So the markets where you do see some price drops now, those are the markets where there is inventory showing up. Either new inventory that's been constructed and put on market, or for whatever reason people are transacting and selling, that's generating more inventory. And you need to see that inventory, the whites of the eyes of that inventory before
Hmm.
you're willing to kind of mark down a price. And so it is just as much of a haggling market as it is a sort of fundamental valuation market.
So I have a follow-up question on this, which is, obviously developers and people who rent out homes like hate having vacancies, right? Like this is like an extremely painful dynamic. And when I look at housing, like if you just think of the word housing crisis, it seems like over the last, 20 years, we've meant like two different things depending on kind of like where the housing valuation is, right? Like when during the great financial crisis, home values go down, housing crisis means that like equity values aren't high enough, right? And then it's like, okay, the home prices go up, and now when we mean housing crisis, we mean that they're too expensive. So I'm kind of wondering how, when you think about housing, do you think that there's like kind of like a cyclicality to it that is like very important, that the government is trying to like target some kind of like price? Do you think that that's like an important component in what makes it go, or do you think that cyclicality is just kind of like an irrelevant feature?
I mean, I sort of think of there as being a very narrow, balanced path under which everything is fine, and then
Yeah.
we're typically far from that. So the balanced path that I have in mind is one in which house prices grow at about the rate of inflation every year. What and let's say wages, whatever, grow at kind of that same rate. So what that's going to kind of mean is that for the typical household, then your sort of like um, income to price ratio is going to be kind of constant. So it's going to be sort of a similar amount of your spending potential to kind of buy a house. And for that homeowner, you're getting a nominal return on the asset itself at a rate of inflation. But if you take advantage of some leverage, let's say you have, let's say 3 or 4 turns of leverage, let's say you're, 20% down payment, 80% LTV, you now have a levered return
Mm.
IRR from your investment in the housing that, can get, let's say, high single digits, low double digits. And that's a perfectly reasonable levered rate of return for a household to kind of get in their housing. So that's kind of the balance path. That's sort of the world. And let's say rents are kind of going around the rate of inflation. That's sort of one in which everyone is sort of okay, and we kind of gyrate radically around that, I would say. So obviously, once prices of rents are growing faster than this, then that's very annoying for the new buyers, and good for the incumbents. When these prices rents are growing below this rate of inflation and maybe falling, that's not great for the existing owners, and they sort of complain. But you're right, there is definitely this tension between
Yeah.
trying to make everyone happy at the same time, and it's not possible to kind of make everyone sort of happy at the same time. um so yeah, I don't know what to say. That's just a big challenge.
Yeah, we're of the. I mean, it's not even really an opinion. It's just an observation that like debt cycles and real estate cycles are just intricately woven. I did kind of want to segue into talking about um, monetary policy, uh, sort of the structures that have been put in place over the years, over the decades, of like lower requirements, or like relaxing of terms on mortgages, the structuring of the 30-year fixed rate, and then the securitization of it, and then eventually, now we're at a point where the Fed owns 2 trillion of MBS securities, because of post Great Financial Crisis, QE, large scale asset purchases, and so on. Um, and the reality is we're at the point that we are at, where the Fed is tapering those holdings, um, and Jerome Powell on Tuesday basically said that uh, they're agnostic towards like stimulating the housing market, which is ironic in my view that they're agnostic towards it now.
Yeah.
Um, but where do we go from here? Right, because the Fed does have like it could single handedly alleviate a good chunk of the mortgage lock in effect that's happening right now. I don't know how squarely that falls within their inflation mandate. Um, you could make an argument it does. Um, but where do we go from here? Is the adjustable rate mortgages, and sort of have we reached the end of financial innovation on the debt and credit side? I know you mentioned on Twitter one time, and I'm throwing a lot at you, but I'll let you speak here in a minute. Um, you mentioned on Twitter like the idea of a variable term mortgage as opposed to a variable rate mortgage, where the monthly payment stays the same, the term is flexible, and that could potentially alleviate a lot of the mortgage lock-in effect. What are your general thoughts on the role of monetary policy going forward? We are where we are, but going forward, and then maybe also on some innovative ideas.
Yeah, lots to dig in there. So the first observation I would sort of make is I sort of think the housing side of the economy and the sort of AI side of the economy sort of do not make up an optimal currency zone. If that makes any sense. So that's really there, I think, in the background with all this. It is we have this massive AI buildup. And
Hmm.
it is, by many estimates, it is like powering our growth. It is consuming a ton of capex. It is, very debt intensive, very equity intensive, et cetera, et cetera. And because of all that stuff, that is lifting up the sort of natural rate of interest to a point where the Fed finds it very hard to kind of cut rates, and it's just sort of crowding out all this capital, which therefore means the housing part of the economy is sort of in a recession.
Mm.
We're not building enough homes. The interest rate is kind of too high. Households are kind of left in this sort of lock-in situation. Um, it's challenging. So if you only were looking at housing, you could say, okay, we clearly need to cut lower rates, et cetera, stimulate some of that back again. But at the same time, there's like AI stuff that's sort of crowding out all this economic activity. So this is fundamentally challenging. So I don't envy the sort of Fed members that have to grapple with those sorts of trade-offs, because if you're just looking at things from the housing standpoint, again, as I mentioned, it seems like a you know pretty bad picture. You kind of want to ease it, but you can't just look at that side of the economy. You have to look at all
Mhm.
the other stuff that's happening in the economy at the same time, and it's kind of hard to have these sort of sectoral sort of things where how are you going to find ways of sort of just helping out the housing part of it without kind of dealing with this kind of massive AI build ups, right? So like what would almost in like to the extent the policymaker could do something about it, it'd almost kind of be ideal to say like, okay, we're gonna have like higher interest rates in like AI stuff. We're gonna like that stuff has to kind of have a higher rate, and
Mm.
housing is gonna get a lower rate. Or there's some exchange rate between housing and AI, and we're gonna allow that to depreciate. That would kind of be like the optimal way of reaching a maybe more sustainable equilibrium. But it ultimately, I think we're just gonna have to wait and see whether the AI stuff is a bubble or not. Like, because if that is, then that just will pop and destroy the economy, and then the good news is we'll get a little bit of housing demand back. That's the only way interest rates are
Suddenly
gonna.
policy will go to preserving home values again because the whole economy will have collapsed, right?
Yeah, we kind of can shift to that mode. And there's a lot of housing equity we can start to untap and sort of use that as a buffer in a downturn. If it's not a bubble, that's like almost scarier than God knows what happens in a world where AI is just like permanently that large of a sector of the economy. That it just seems
Mhm.
like so bizarre. I don't know if that answers your question, but that sort of work where that thing is a trade off for monetary policy right now, is how
Yeah.
to deal with this bifurcated economy and so forth. And ultimately, the response just kind of has to do with the fact that if it whether or not it's a bubble. With financial innovation, this is something I've been reading about a little bit, and I've been sort of fascinated to learn sort of the history of the sort of contracting design, because we basically in the 70s had very similar issues in a way, a lot of inflation, boom bust dynamics, and that actually led to a lot of financial contract innovation. So
Mm.
in the U.S., adjust rate mortgages were actually illegal in the 70s. They had to kind of legalize them, and actually, what happened in the US is they legalized at the same time a number of different mortgage types. So they actually legalized, for example, a tilt mortgage, where you're actually going to kind of pay more in nominal terms, similar amount in sort of real terms over time, because they kind of were worried about sort of the path of inflation. And that sort of means that with a lot of inflation, you're sort of paying a lot upfront with a
Mm.
fixed rate contract. And so they kind of tilt mortgage to kind of deal with that. They legalized the adjustable rate mortgage, but even in the 80s, they actually legalized it with this feature I discovered. So in the 80s, you could get a adjust rate mortgage that either had a higher payment when interest rates went up, or you could get one that had this extension feature where the
Mm.
number of time periods you're paying off the debt goes longer when interest rates go up and gets shorter when interest rates go down. Or you could have a hybrid kind of between these two options. So actually, these were all legalized and all seem to have existed in the marketplace. Then Fannie and Freddie sort of kind of did a little bit of contract selection and pruning, and they sort of said, okay, this just for rate mortgage that we know today with the payment fluctuation, that's going to be kind of the standard one. Other countries actually still originate this kind of extension mortgage. In Finland,
Hmm.
this is like 15% of mortgage originations are this extending term thing. And I do think there would be value in having that around today, because one of the big problems we have in the marketplace is that fixed rate mortgage, this massive spread between the equivalent risk-free rate and what a mortgage rate is.
Mhm.
So right now that's in the neighborhood of 220 to 30 basis points, of which like 60 basis points is actually there to compensate for default. So the rest of that spread is like interest rate stuff that is kind of related to prepayment risk. So
Mhm.
basically, the fact that you can refinance, prepay your fixed rate mortgage on demand is inducing, especially in today's macroeconomic environment, a massive premium. So it's very expensive to get a mortgage, and that's why there's this whole discussion of monetary policy. I think if we could originate this kind of mortgage structure that had this kind of extension feature, for a variety of reasons, the borrowers would not endogenously take up the prepayment aspect of it. So I think you could originate it at a far lower spread. So it'd be way cheaper for
Hmm.
households to actually get this kind of mortgage.
Hmm. Before we ask any more questions, I want to just point out that we've already taken 45 minutes of your time. So if you need to get off or anything, just let us know. So I just
Yeah,
want
yeah,
to make
I'm
sure
good.
that we're
We
being
could go for a
respectful of
bit.
your time. Okay,
Yeah.
so one of the questions
Mhm.
that that I had as you were talking about this is that even in Finland, you had mentioned that it's only like 15% of people who have it. Why is it that people would not select into it more? It seems like that you would rather have like stability on cash flows, like, and then like the exact time horizon stuff is easy because you can always sell the house in the future. Like it seems like if I'm thinking from a personal finance perspective, it seems obvious. So I guess do you know anything about why Fannie and Freddie Mac originated with the choice that they had, and then why it, like, even in countries where this one is a competing option, people don't choose it?
So this mortgage would be, I think, particularly advantageous in the US because it's
Yeah.
competing against a fixed rate mortgage product that has that freely prepayable option built into it. And we've just decided for reasons of public policy, that's how we're going to originate, the standard products, 30-year fixed rate and prepayable as well. So that again means that the fixed rate mortgage has to be originated with this massive spread to account for the free ability of households to refinance and prepay it well, which is like a massively difficult risk for banks to hedge against. In other countries, they don't do that. They don't originate long-term fixed rate mortgages with prepayable options. Like Denmark is kind of the exception. Um, and actually, Denmark does have this extension contract too. So that means the benefit of, in just in spread terms, of having whatever is your local fixed rate option or this, extension option, it's not so large.
Hmm.
Basically, because it's going to be hard. You're not prepaying anyway. If you're not prepaying
Yeah.
with a fixed rate option, if you have one, 'cause it's not built in. You're not prepaying with this one, where the extension kind of deals with the prepayment risk. So it exists. It's there in Italy. It's there in Denmark. It's there in Finland with some percentage originations, but it's just not. It's not super attractive. I think actually in the U.S., that's my guess, is if you could find a way of creating and originating this product, it would be very competitive compared to our 30-year fixed rate prepayable FRM, because lacking people taking that prepayment as much, it would be possible to originate that at a much lower interest rate. So that would again
Hmm.
improve affordability for households at the cost of some payment uncertainty towards the end of that.
Hmm. Yeah. It's interesting. So we've kind of like established the view of the securitization of mortgages and all of these types of this progression towards more relaxed standards of lending in mortgages as a form of demand subsidy. And it seems just over time we've tried a bunch of different types of demand subsidies, both on the fiscal side, the monetary side, et cetera. Um, what what in the way of supply subsidies? I mean, it's unsavory to talk about like tax incentives for home builders and private corporations, but what in the way of supply side subsidies have we not tried and that may be worth looking into?
Yeah. Okay. The great segue to a piece I'll be releasing very soon. So this is maybe a little advertisement for that.
Hmm.
This is a piece. It's should be like in the final revision process now, but it's on industrial policy,
Mm-hmm.
which for housing. So I think that would be like an example of the supply side policy that we could do. So um, it, one of the things we talk about in this piece is going to be the Operation Breakthrough, which was a example of industrial policy, supply side policy that we had done in the 60s to try to make manufactured housing a bigger deal in this
Mm-hmm.
country. And sort of take some lessons from that, as well as other countries that have tried industrial policy, think about what that would look like in the U.S. So aspects of that would include R&D for improving our construction productivity. So the background of all these discussions is that the productivity for construction has like actually fallen over time somehow. It's the workers you need to build a home has like gone up. So that's like the biggest supply side problem to kind of fix. And R&D efforts are one part of that. Another part of that is to try to provide, it's a demand side subsidy, but try to provide some sort of demand aggregation services to allow for these manufactured housing producers to have a consistent sort of source of demand so they can kind of scale up their production and try to innovate a little bit in producing factory built housing that can serve many more people. So kind of get more the supply side sort of added on there. regulatory standardization, particularly like building codes, I think also helpful to further that supply side thing. And then also, we kind of talk about some of the difficulties with infill. It's related to these challenges of land aggregation. So it's hard to put together parcels and kind of build housing units. So the government could sort of help with that a little bit too, sort of help agglomerate, assemble land a little bit, and that would also improve the economies of scale with respect to this kind of factory built production. So those are some things that that'll come out in all in a piece soon on industrial policy for housing. Other supply side incentives I would point to, if you look historically at when have we built a lot of multifamily in this country in the last 70 years, there are two periods that really stand out in that. One is kind of the late 60s, early 70s. That's sort of when the FHA did a lot of sort of financing options for multifamily. And the other is the 80s. We built a lot of multifamily in the 80s. There, we had like very favorable tax treatment for housing developers. We had sort of combination of tax shelters and depreciation allowances that led to a very favorable sort of financing environment for developers. So the depreciation component, something that one big bill, better, whatever, OBBB. It did a little bit of TCJA, it did a little bit of, but not nearly to the level that it happened in the 80s. So that is just sort of providing tax treatment, which it doesn't actually change the like total amount of tax collected from developers, but it sort of changes the timing of these depreciation allowances. So with these bonus or accelerated depreciation schedules, you sort of claim it all up front. And therefore you get this sort of reduction in your hurdle rate of after tax returns. That can really, seems like it sort of can amplify the developer decision to build. So,
Mhm.
yeah, so those are other things I would point to as being other meaningful supply side incentives.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess we can sort of wrap pretty soon. One more thing that we've done some work on is sort of the immigration impact, the deportation impact on labor supply.
Mhm.
Um, what have you seen related to that? And I do wonder to what extent sort of the AI data center capex boom is tapping the same construction resources, labor
Mm.
resources, namely. Um, so what have you seen on that, and what are your thoughts on sort of a finite amount of resources, labor wise, with a lot of demand right now and deportations?
Yeah, yeah. I just got into a very hostile argument with someone who won't name, and he was like just yelling at me, like, "What is the evidence that the deportations are doing anything?" And yeah, it's true. I don't have any evidence that they're having an impact. But what I would say to uh, to this broader point here about kind of labor and housing is the way we use labor in construction is kind of nuts. Both with respect to the fact that we have all this sort of site built housing has to be built on site. So we have very little role for manufactured housing or off-site components being done in a factory and kind of delivered on site.
Hmm.
And what all this kind of means is that the construction industry is, as a result, it's really prioritizing kind of like risk management, and it's sort of scaling up, scaling down. It's dealing with very variable demand. And the way the industry has evolved to deal with that is to basically put the risk of all this stuff on this largely undocumented worker population, because you just sort of ramp up, ramp down your kind of need for these workers. Move people around whatever geographic market you're sort of building in, and you don't have as a result a stable workforce because you have all this risk that you've kind of put on the workers themselves. So in that environment, it's true that I do think the changing immigration enforcement will affect the labor pool. I do think it's also true that probably this sort of competition with data centers also impacts the labor flow. But I also think this like method of construction is kind of nuts, and
Mm.
it would be ideal to sort of shift to a more systematic factory build construction schedule where we have factories with workers that are building those on like a more long-term basis, and then the resulting product is then sort of shipped over place, and then we kind of have the scope for productivity enhances over time, so we don't need as many workers to sort of work in these factories. And I actually think this is something that can be a sort of bipartisan sort of agenda. So I think if you're a Trump administration supporter, I think this should be very favorable to you because this
This
allows you to still have housing and
and
not
this
have.
is your manufacturing renaissance.
Yeah, this is your manufacturing renaissance here. I think, if you're on the left, you should welcome cheaper housing options and kind of like a faster pipeline to getting it done. So I hope there is some room for a bipartisan sort of move around this. But
Hmm.
um, anyway, yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Well, it's been really fun chatting with you, and like
Mhm.
thank you for letting us pick your brain and try to download a little bit more information on housing. For the 60 some odd people who are here, I just want to remind you all that the essay contest that we have with a grand prize of $2,500 closes at the end of this month on October 31st. So
Yep,
if you
2 weeks
haven't,
from today.
yeah, 2 weeks from today, if you haven't applied, if you know anyone at NYU, by the way, who you think would be interested in submitting something, feel free to share it with them. Any last words, Will?
No,
No,
it's
that's
been.
yeah. Yeah.
I was just going to say it's been a fascinating conversation. We look forward to continuing to interact with your work and your online presence, and we really look forward to more to come.
Yeah, just want to say thank you for inviting me here. This is a lot of fun. I
Mhm.
hope to do again soon.
Awesome. Cool.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. Have a good day.
All right.
Okay,
Bye.
bye everyone.